I would like to welcome you all to this conversation. My name is Vorre Hansen. I'm an associate professor at Roskilde University. I'm an anthropologist and I've been working as a consultant for many years before I returned to academia. I have always been working with user-driven innovation and entrepreneurship across sectors. Currently, I'm concerned with social innovation and more specifically with how a high degree of democratic participation might lead to sustainable change. That is part of the backdrop of the conversation topic of today, which is co-ownership. We will talk about co-ownership as a specific form of organizing. What does it entail? How does the landscape look like? And more specifically, what are the potentials for this specific form of organizing? Thus, I would like to welcome you, Andreas Pinstrup Jørgensen, CEO of the think tank Demokratisk Erhverv. Andreas, you have authored this book, Co-Owner. Could you please tell us a bit about your own background, but also your motivation for writing this specific book?
Yes, of course. Well, so I did my studies in sociology and political science, and after that I went to study at Yale for a year, and that was actually where I hatched the idea of for Medejer, co-owner, as we talk about the book here. So, but actually what happened was, because I was actually quite skeptical at that point about co-ownership. I didn't really believe that co-ownership could manage much, you know. So when I heard of it first time, actually it was in a frosty, cold room at Yale University, with a highly pregnant professor coming into the room. She said, "Now I'm going to tell you a story about a company in the northern part of Spain. It's called Mondragon. This company has turned out to be more productive. It's been more stable over the years. It is the bankruptcy percentage of the 200 firms that's there of 2%, which is nothing. Through the years, scientists have looked into this phenomenon and found it very, very interesting. And you know, in total, this is not that surprising. You know, some companies are just more successful than others. But a company, that was the point of her talk, is that this company was co-owned by the employees. So it was an employee-owned company, completely employee-owned and employee-controlled. So that a company that was employee-controlled could have existed for 80 years, with a higher productivity and higher stability than other companies of its size and branch, was to me quite exceptional at that time. So that left definitely quite a big mark on me. And there was also a personal side to this story, because my grandfather, he actually brought Adidas, some would say, to Denmark. So through this process, he made a company that became quite large in Denmark, because he had sovereignty on selling Adidas for a long while. And he actually tried to make the employees owners. And at that point, when I was at Yale University, I hadn't thought much about my grandfather's failure actually at overturning his company to the employees, or transferring it. But suddenly, at that moment in that cold room, I realized that this was something I just had to dwell deeper into.
And so you did?
I did, yeah.
Could you tell me a bit, because I'm a scientist, so I'm concerned with the methodology.
Yeah.
So what data is the book based upon, and how did you approach data?
Actually, it's funny, because it was in a way inverse. So first of all, I was very surprised about hearing about the productivity point, stability point. So I went to do a meta-study of all these studies in the area of productivity and stability, and I went through more than 100 studies on performance. And found the point seemed to be, quite frankly, that in the university, among professors in economic sciences, there wasn't a big disagreement about if these kinds of companies were more productive. It was more, why are they this productive? So that was kind of like, to me, was quite surprising. Also that, actually also the point that they were so often you say in science that the popular world, politics, society is often 10, 15 years behind science in this area, and when a consensus is formed, it will take a decade or so before the knowledge is kind of like diffused into the rest of the society. So it seemed to be very much the point when it came to co-ownership or employee ownership. So that surprised me, and I decided to look into the meta-studies part. It seemed I went through a few hundred studies. It seemed it's very strong when it comes to productivity. There's fewer studies when it comes to stability, and there's a range of studies looking into stress, well-being, and we'll look into that further, I guess, later in our talk. But after that, I found okay, the study says this, but it's hard sometimes to actually believe what the studies say. So I felt like I had to get out there and understand, why is this? Where are these companies? Is this really real? Is this real? And so I did. So I visited companies in particular Italy and Spain, where they have a lot of employee-owned companies, fully employee-owned companies. And I read case studies from the States and from the UK, visited companies in Denmark that were employee-owned, and I had interviews with 30, 40 different people. I make observational studies also in the different companies, talk to employees on the floor in both big factory production facilities and quite small companies. And there were definitely some factors that aligned, that were equal in the two different settings, and that's of course why I write about it in Medaya.
Yeah. Do you differ between employee-owned companies and cooperatives, or what is the distinction, if there is any? Yeah,
definitely there is. So I would say that normally cooperatives is the general definition in Anglo-Saxon societies, and internationally speaking, we use the term cooperatives as the super term, for companies that are ruled according to the 7 cooperative principles from Rochdale in England. And these principles, among others, they're based on one member, one vote. So it's not $1, one vote, £1, one vote, and that it's so that the cooperative is formed to solve some kind of need among the members. And those are two of the most important principles. So employee ownership is what I would say one of the 3 or 4 different kinds of cooperatives. So there are employee-owned cooperatives, there's producer-owned cooperatives. Producer-owned cooperatives, also, in Denmark we know them as Arla, Tisa, we also know them as Danish Crown with the selling base, but there's a lot in the agricultural sector that are producer-owned. You see them everywhere in the world. And then you've got the consumer-owned companies in the retail sector often, and you have them all around the world also. Retail sector, in Denmark, co-op, you have co-ops, it's called co-op, Co-op Denmark. You have them all over Europe, you also have some in the States and in the UK. And then you also have a lot of different insurance companies, you have utility companies and so on in consumer-owned companies. And then sometimes you talk about a fourth, and then maybe a hybrid, it would be sometimes you have hybrids between consumer-owned and employee-owned companies. You have that in the northern part of Spain, for example. But the 3 kinds are probably the most normally used in this sense.
And how does the landscape internationally look like in regards to employee-owned companies?
Yeah, actually, so the interesting thing is, and that was also for me, it makes sense that they were so keen and interested in employee-owned companies in the States, because they've actually seen quite a wave of new employee-owned companies in the entire Anglo-Saxon world. In the States, it's actually been going on for a long time. In the 1970s, there was only about 1,000 employee-owned companies. Whereas today we have more than 13,000 companies that are employee-owned, and it's about it's 5% of the population in the States that work in employee-owned companies. So it's actually quite a power factor in the States. But also in UK, where in 2009 they made new regulations after the Nuttall Review, which was a very important paper published by the Ministry of Finance. The Nuttall Review showed that these companies, which we will get back to, had a number of quite interesting traits, and that gave, at that time, the Conservative government under David Cameron reason to improve the conditions for employee-owned companies. So that meant that in the years 2015 to 2017, you had double-digit growth in this kind of company, and it was the company form that was growing the most, actually. So that's highly interesting. So we actually see that the Anglo-Saxon world, the combination of company and democracy has actually been something that they have been developing for a very long time, whereas in Europe, in Northern Europe, Central Europe, it has not been as common, but in Southern Europe, in Italy and in Spain, you've seen a lot of these companies. So the last systematic collection of data on this point points to a report done by Cooperatives Europe in 2013. Actually, those are the last numbers I know well. There hasn't actually been any substantial collection of data on what do we see about new democratic or employee-owned companies. And it turned out that actually in Italy, you saw in 2013 about 7,500 new companies. In Belgium, you saw about 650. In Sweden, you see every year, there's been like the last 20 years, you see between 200 and 600 new companies forming, cooperative companies, whereas in Denmark, you only see 20. And that's more or less the same number today. We do see quite a lot of, I think we do see a growth in these years in Denmark, especially in the countryside, with new consumer-owned companies appearing. But we do indeed still have big issues in Denmark. Whereas in the past, we did have we do have a rich heritage in Denmark of democratic companies, and still almost 10% of the total economy of private companies in Denmark are produced by democratic companies. But today, we hardly see any new ones, and that's a big problem.
Yeah, interesting. Could you sum up the key findings of your study? What would those be?
Yeah. So the key findings are that when the employees own and democratically control the company, you do see quite significant effects in productivity, between 2 and 4%, statistically speaking, in general. You also see gains in stability, both like in years of average lifespan of a company, but also actually you see in crises they seem to do very well, not only when it comes to its economy, but also when it comes to stability of employment. So that they do not seem to need to lay off as many workers in crises as other companies do, which is a hugely beneficial factor for society. And then apart from that, we also of course have the third, and I think also very important factor is like the meaning that is actually the different kind of work life this creates for people. That this is an arena where people can actually, will find a reservoir of meaning, because being both owner and democratically in control of something, apparently, that's what it seems, creates a certain kind of ownership, a feeling of ownership, and an ownership culture, as I call it in the book. And this ownership culture has some significant, very interesting potentials.
So it's not only about co-ownership, it's also about access to power in regards to decision-making processes.
Yeah, definitely. Actually, I think I was just thinking of a very interesting study done in Michigan, of all places, where they looked into what happens when people own the company and engage in the company democratically. What happens in their surroundings, and surrounding area. What turned out, and this is very interesting because this has been looked into by Carol Paton also, is that the people that democratically learned how to engage in the company suddenly afterwards also started engaging outside in civil life, politically or just engaged actively. So this actually, this is something that theoreticians have often sought after, because this having a high degree of social capital in society is very important, binding it together, and that, you know, training people to be active or engage politically, democratically in the company apparently also empowers them to engage in civil society. So that's, of course, that's very interesting.
Up until now, we have mainly been talking about either startups or companies that were kind of born as cooperatives or employee-owned. How about traditional businesses? Could they reorganize, or what are the experiences and knowledge about that?
They definitely could. Actually, from the studies I talked about before on productivity, there's several studies that are natural experiments where a company that not have employee ownership before have suddenly transferred ownership to the employees. So it can be done, and actually the big growth we've seen in the UK is a result of is a result of new legislation that makes it easier for old owner leaders to transfer their power or ownership to the employees, to an employee ownership trust. So we know that this is possible, and it's actually a good idea. So the way to speak about it is also that often you could talk about this continuum where you have on one side you have you could call it employee-owned cooperatives, where the employees own the entire company and control it fully, and then in the other extreme you have the employee share programs. So where only a few employees perhaps own like very little of the company. So it's in this spectrum that employee-owned companies exist, and I write of all of them, you could say. And the general findings, of course, is that when you have a broader and deeper employee ownership, when you move from not many owners, few of the people in the company that own, and they own only a little of the company, to more people owning and owning a big part of the company, you see higher productivity, stability gains, and more meaning in general in the company.
Down the same line, what are the potentials if we look at future entrepreneurs, for example? Have you some thoughts on that?
Oh yeah, definitely. Actually, some of the most interesting results comes from the entrepreneurial sector, because so this is general for cooperatives, but also employee-owned companies. So we know that cooperatives seem to be up to twice the probability of surviving after 5 years than other companies do. So where we normally talk about between 35 to 60%, 35 to 40% survival rates among normal companies after 5 years, you see survival rates among cooperatives in several studies done around Europe between 75 and 85%. So this is of course extremely interesting. So that's one thing, of course, survival rates. But it's also interesting looking at cooperatives when you talk about the potential of activating and, well, first of all, maybe solving societal issues, environmental issues, that this kind of company has already ingrained in the DNA code that they have been shaped and formed to solve some kind of common dilemma. It could be just, employment. It could be that some people go together and just say, well, we're unemployed, how can we solve that problem, of course? And that could often be the case in employee-owned companies. But you do see a lot of employee-owned companies and democratic companies in general that they go together and say, yeah, well, it's actually some kind of societal issues that we want to solve. So that this employee democratic company may speak to quite a different and more diverse group of people, including people, scholars from social sciences and human sciences, humanities, that have not in general been thinking so much about becoming entrepreneurs as people maybe in business and economy and so on has. So our results, we're actually right now performing a pilot study where we are doing a small incubator for democratic companies, for companies that would like to, or groups that would like to create democratic companies. And it turned out that the people that wanted to be part of this incubator was primarily women, 57%, and there was a lot, well, almost 80-90% of them were people from humanities, the scholars from humanities and social sciences. So there's definitely something to to find in the entrepreneurial sector here when you talk about employee-owned companies.
Does it somehow challenge the idea of the entrepreneur as an individual actor? I cannot help but think in collective social entrepreneurship, or the idea that we go together as a group to do something differently.
I do think so. So I think that a lot of the story and narrative about the entrepreneur, the ones we know today, are definitely based on the idea of one individual doing something amazing and having success. And that leaves out probably 90% of the population, because most people want to do something in common and community. And the interesting thing is that for some reason, and it might not be very rational, this idea of the one true exceptional individual that creates something very valuable is not really, when you look into companies in general, that's not the general picture. You don't have these, you have very few of these single people entrepreneurs. The entrepreneurial businesses that thrive and do the best are teams of individuals that work well together. We know that from a lot of studies.
Yeah. Andreas, it has been really rewarding to hear your thoughts on these different topics. And I think there's really food for thought, hopefully also prospectively. But do you have a last comment?
Yes, well, actually, I would probably rephrase Carol Pateman, a political scientist, theoretician. She's passed now, but it was something that marked me when I read it. And what she says is that how come democratic societies that hail the idea of democracy in their society spend most of their waking hours in autocracies? That's a question we could put ourselves. And I believe that there's a big value to that, thinking about how is it that we work these 8, 9, 10-hour shift in companies, most of us at least, that we have no democratic or control of. Maybe we have influence in our local environment, our local working environment, but not really about where the company is going or what the company is achieving. And that's also part, I think, of the big crises for companies today. So a company today cannot just be a company that creates profit. It needs to solve a real issue. So this grand crises, meaning crises for companies and value crises is something that at least employee ownership could be part of the solution to.
So what you're saying is that it might not only be about a good work life, it might be about good lives in general. Yeah,
definitely. I think it's very important to focus on the value and the meaning part of it. What I see, what I've seen when I visited, and today I'm friends with a lot of people that work in these employee-owned companies, is that they feel a completely different kind of influence and control over their work environment. They feel in control. Something we didn't talk that much about here is that we're also seeing this, what some scientists at least call a stress epidemic. And we know that here in Denmark, for example, the public officials talk about ESO strain as one of the big reasons for people becoming sick with stress. And that's, that is a high number of or high work pressure combined with little influence in what you're doing. And in democratic companies, it's a way of actually reassuring that you actually have influence. I see some companies that choose only to work 20 hours a day because that's what they want to do, and some people in companies and some people deciding on what kinds of tasks or ideas or things they want to work with because they can decide themselves, This is highly interesting, although of course there's also business, sometimes it's tough and hard, but there is definitely an interesting potential here.
Yeah, but you have a kind of hardcore economic argument also.
Yeah, sure.
It's about economic resilience.
Definitely. I think there's also a way of breaking through, because if you don't have this argument in order, very few politicians want to listen to you. But when you have this in order, and then you can say, this is a way of reframing the work life for people, then there's, and maybe that's really one of the most important things. If you can both reframe the work life, create more meaning in the work life, as well as solving some of the big societal issues, then I think, of course, this is only one step in that direction. There's a lot of other things that we need to do, but I think there is a certain potential in employee ownership in democratic companies.
Definitely. Thank you so much, Andreas.
You're welcome. Thank you for...
And thank you all, and
me.
we look forward to continue the conversation with all of you.